If buying a home feels overwhelming, you are not behind. You are just stepping into a process that no one ever fully explains. And that's exactly what we're breaking down in today's episode. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Sam Enright, and sitting across from me is my co-host, Zach Dickson. And today, guys, we are talking about what makes buying feel so overwhelming. Zach, what's going on, man?
Oh, not a whole lot. Ready to go for another recording episode this morning. Super excited to dive in on why this feels so overwhelming and kind of dissect the details. What's in the weeds on these things, and why exactly it feels so overwhelming for buyers.
Yeah, today is going to be a good episode for you guys. Obviously, going to dive a little bit deeper into why this process ultimately feels so overwhelming for most people, and kind of normalize that a little bit, right? Because I feel like sometimes we can feel like we're on an island when it comes to these things, and that we're the only ones who feel overwhelmed in certain situations, right? And that's not typically the case. This is, definitely one of those things that, most people are going to have some sort of emotions towards. So obviously want to break that down for you guys a little bit, normalize it for you and help you maybe compartmentalize it in your head so that it can feel less overwhelming when you do decide to, embark on that journey, right? So I guess the best place to start is, and Zach, if you want to take us into this, is ultimately, why is it that what would you say is the reasons that this is a overwhelming process? Like what goes into it that makes people feel overwhelmed?
Yeah, for sure. That was a good point there too, though, of just, normalizing it. I think that's a big goal of today's episode is making sure that people feel like they're not alone in this feeling. Like this is a very, very common feeling, especially for first-time home buyers. And I guess the reason why, and obviously there's multiple reasons, but there is just the biggest one, and is one that we've talked about in previous episodes, previous content, is ultimately when you look at that number, when you write an offer, whether it be 200,000, 250,000, up to 500,000, whatever that number may be, that is just a very, very large number. I remember as a kid, not really understanding how everything worked, and I heard a house sold for $100,000, and I couldn't wrap my head around like how do you buy that? That is just so much money. You know what I mean? Without really knowing how the process worked. And so I think ultimately that is probably the biggest reason why it feels overwhelming for buyers, and especially first time home buyers as a whole. And then obviously as you get into the process, as you get into the weeds of the deal itself, there are so many decisions that go into it, whether it is pre-contract or post-contract. There is just so many decisions that you have to make as the home buyer. And feeling like you made the wrong decision on one of those can ultimately hinder you in your decision making process for the next one, and goes and continue on down the line, so on and so forth. And so I think it just goes back to a couple of episodes ago, is just feeling confident in these decisions that you're making when you have to make them, because again, there are so many of them throughout the process. And there is just a lot of unknowns as well. Being a first time home buyer, you don't really know what to expect. And so I think that is part of the reason why, as we've talked about, that we're doing this podcast and content in general, is to kind of shed light on those unknowns and to make those unknowns a known for you as a buyer when you get started on the journey. Because again, that will lead to more confidence, that will lead to better decisions being made throughout the process, and will allow you to free yourself up, I think, is the best term to put it that way.
Yeah. And I think, excuse me, one of those other, inside of all of that, right? When you have decisions, when you have a lot of numbers, when there are unknowns, what is that ultimately creating inside of you? That is creating a sense of fear. It is creating a sense of unknowns. And when you have unknowns, typically there's going to be fear that comes along with that, right? And so when we get into these larger decisions in life, whether that's, changing a job where, you've been with a certain company for a certain amount of time and you have a new opportunity and you want to change and you think it's going to be great, but then there's also that fear because there's a comfortability level of being at said job and just things that you've gotten accustomed to. When it comes to taking on, a house payment, when it's, this large thing, maybe your rent's this amount and you're going up, 500, $600 in a house payment. There's a fear of, am I going to be able to make this payment? Is everything going to be able to sustain? How am I going to take care of this house? What if things go wrong? Right. And so there is these unknowns, which then causes fear inside of us that obviously, I have my own interpretation of how to get rid of fear, but that is, through action, right? And so a lot of times, we will continue to fear the things that we avoid. And so I think that that's another big reason why people feel overwhelmed, is just the fear overall of the process and fear of what is to come from it. I think a lot of people get excited about the prospect of buying a home, but sometimes when they sit down and they think about it, there is a level of fear that comes along with that. And so that is another thing that can definitely be overwhelming. So, inside of that, I think ultimately preparing yourself, all these things that we've been, beating dead over the last 2 months of just, getting prepared, getting that clarity, making sure you understand the process, understand all of these different things, right? Those are going to be your key factors that help you move forward. But ultimately, the biggest thing is that, action has to come from behind that as well. Clarity is great, understanding a process, having these things, that's all wonderful. But until you actually go out and do it, that's just knowledge in your brain, right? And so, there is going to be some clarity that comes from that knowledge, but, the ultimate factor of getting rid of that fear and making a decision is only going to come through action. So, just something I wanted to throw in there as well.
Yeah, great points for sure. Great points, because again, and kind of adding on to that, it's just, the fear of making the wrong move, the fear of indecision. Those are the two things too that we see often with home buyers as well, especially when they get started on the journey. If you're not confident in the decisions that you're making, you're going to be scared to make the wrong move, and ultimately that usually leads you to a path of making the wrong move, kind of counterintuitive as it is. Being scared to make the wrong move, it usually leads you to making the wrong moves.
Yeah, so guys, that takes us into ultimately why this process is different from other processes, right? I mean, a lot of people have gone out, they've bought a car in their life, whether that's, a new car, used car, whatever the case may be. I would say for most people outside of a home, that typically is going to be your next largest purchase, right? When you go out, I still remember to the day when I went to the Toyota dealership and, signed my lease papers. And that felt like, such a huge, milestone in my life. And of course, there was fear that came from that as well. So I think with a car, right, that is kind of your next evolution of a step. I know we see people online post about, hey, I made, my first adult decision. I went out and got this car and I'm taking on this payment and that sort of thing. If I, when it comes to a house though, obviously we're talking about, maybe potentially what, a $30,000-$40,000 car, and you're buying, probably in today's market, just being honest, at minimum 175, at maximum maybe you're getting up to $300,000-$400,000 in a purchase price, right? So if you're at $300,000-$400,000, you're 10xing what that car cost. So it's a much bigger purchase, and it comes with a lot more things that go into it, right? So it's a highly financial decision. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into it because you don't want to lose your house, you don't want to go into foreclosure, you don't want to have to deal with late payments and the things that could come along with that credit wise. Then there's the emotional side of it, right? We've talked about this: going out, looking at houses, becoming emotionally involved with these houses, and it's an emotional transaction, a little bit more than a car, right? Because you're thinking about, this is the place where I could, if you already have a family, this is a place where I'm going to continue to raise my kids. Or if you haven't yet, hey, this is a place that potentially, we're going to start a family and we're going to start having kids and we're going to put them in this room and this, and what school district are we living in, and all these different things, right? And so all of those things inside of us create these emotional attachments. And, that can make it a very high stress situation, right? The more emotions you have involved in something, typically the more stressful that situation is going to be, because you are attached to an outcome. Whereas, if you're making a small, you're going to get Chipotle, you're probably not very emotionally attached to that, to that decision, right? It's just, okay, yep, we're gonna get some food and call it a day. So, or grocery shopping or anything like that, right? There's not a high level of emotions that go into that. So there's typically going to be a little bit less stress. And then the other thing is obviously it's a very long-term decision, right? Most of your mortgages are going to be 30 years. However, I mean, the data and the stats would say that most people are not going to live in their home for 30 years. Most of the time you're going to buy, sell, in 5 to 7 years of owning that home. But again, 5 to 7 years is not a short timeline. 30 years is definitely not a short timeline. So it is a long-term financial decision. It's not something that you're just going to turn around in a year and walk away from, if you go sign a lease for, a place to rent or something like that, right? So there is a lot of there is a long termness to this that also creates stress and overwhelm. And then obviously it's public. Most people when you go and buy a house, you're normally talking with most people, whether that's people in your friend group, whether that's your family members. And so with that, which obviously we'll cover in the next section, but when things are public, right, there's going to be, as we've seen in the day of social media and all these things, we have a lot of opinions that are being thrown around out there, right? So you have this idea of what you want, of what you're looking to do. And the more and more people that you let in on that decision, the more and more opinions you're going to get that may not co-align with yours, that may co-align with yours. Oftentimes we're hearing a lot of different things from both sides of the spectrum, right? And so that can feel like a very overwhelming thing, especially when it is kind of on public display and you have people inside of your circle that know what's going on, and are maybe frequently asking for updates and just different things, right? You're going to have a sense of maybe a little bit of overwhelmingness from that. If somebody is, really on it about you, like, hey, this, that, you need to be doing this, I bought a house, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever. And, obviously interjecting their opinion on all of that. So obviously, with all that said, it's not a small decision. It is very, very layered. There's a lot of things that go into it to make buying a home possible. And that's just the side of things before we even get into like actually, like the loan side of it and all those different things, right? There's just a lot that goes into it because it's coming at you from all different angles. You got financial, you got emotional, you have the long term, that, that thought of how long is this going to be? I'm going to own this home for 30 years. 10 years, whatever the case may be. And then obviously you have people that are involved in it. Normally, if you're going out and buying a car, you're probably not consulting with 7 people, 8 people about buying said car before you do it. You normally just go to the car dealership or, and you just maybe got 1 or 2 friends that help you and you go make the decision and then that's that, right? So this is definitely much different when it comes to buying a home.
Yeah, great points there, honestly. And I really want to kind of hit home the publicness, the other opinions that you gather throughout this process. You're going to hear so much information, and that's obviously it's a sneak peek into our next segment of the episode, but there is just so much information that you're going to absorb throughout this entire, getting started process, that if you kind of let all of that information bog you down, you're not necessarily ever going to be able to get started in the process. And obviously you're going to be getting opinions from people that you value, opinions that you value from people. And so, like, if you trust these people on other aspects of your life and other decisions of your life, you're obviously going to be trusting them with this decision as well. And the more and more that you get, the more information that you get, you are going to be at some point have conflicting information, and that is going to cloud your judgment and not allow you to feel as convicted in your decision making as a whole. So that was the point that I really wanted to hammer home there, because again, I see that very often, whether that's parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents, all of the above. A lot of information is going to be coming from people that you trust, and not all the time is that information going to align in perfect fashion and allow you to just make a smooth, easy decision based on all that information there.
That is a perfect segue into obviously what our three main drivers of stress are going to be that we oftentimes see with, most of our clients who are going through this process, right? And so that takes us into number one, which is information overload. And this could be obviously not just opinions, but it could be all of the different loan options out there, right? It could be all of the well, I
Homes,
guess.
all the
Yeah, all the
homes out there,
homes. Yeah.
everything, yeah,
You
everything there.
yeah, exactly. So you have a lot of homes to choose from. You have obviously a lot of different, most people are going to have different buckets of loan products that they're going to fit into, and they have to decide which one's going to be best for them. Is it the one with minimum down payment? Is the one with a higher down payment? Is the one with no down payment? Right? It's all these different things, and then you toss in, advice from maybe your real estate agent. You toss in advice from your lender. You toss in advice from family members, and so you have all of this information, right, that you're being given, and so I've had times where I was actually going through a course last week, and I just was, kind of going through it. And the more and more I kept listening, the more and more overwhelmed I felt, because it was like all of these things sound like amazing things to start implementing, right? But you start to look at it and it's like, this is just an overload. I can't implement all of these things in a week's timeline. And so, you just got to sit back and kind of break it all down. And I think that's really what, the information process is about is, okay, I have all this information, but what are my most important key points, right? So when it comes to a loan, what is my most important thing that I am looking for? Is that being able to maintain money on the back end? So I want to go with a minimum down payment product. Is that, hey, I want my monthly payment to be lower, so I want to go with a higher down payment product. Um, and then houses, right? What are my key things that I need? Do I need 3 beds? Do I need 2 baths? Do I need a certain amount of square footage? Do I need a certain amount of land that comes along with this home? Like, what are my main drivers? Because again, I think we all know there's not going to be a perfect home. There's not going to be a perfect situation. It's all going to be relative to you, right? And so you have to pick out, I think, what are the most important things that you need to listen to and that you need for your own life. Ultimately, the information is given so that you can understand what's going on and then make a decision that's best for you, right? That's what we use information for. It's not so that we can take that and apply what works for somebody else to ourselves and expect the same result, right? It's so you can dissect that information, decide, okay, what is best for me? These are the things that I need. Okay, perfect. Boom. Let's go create a plan around what is best for you, right? So I think that's kind of why people that's one of the main stress drivers, but I think that's also a way to counteract that, is to really take that information, sit down. I know you guys have heard pros and cons list, grabbing out the old yellow legal pad, putting it in a column. But honestly, like, sitting down and putting your thoughts onto paper and putting these things that you understand and that you want on paper makes it a lot easier to digest than just having all of this stuff floating around in your brain, giving you all different types of, circumstances and all these different things that could potentially work out, right?
For sure. The example that I love, honestly, is like you're so much more likely to achieve your goals when you actually write them out and you see them every single day of your life, rather than, again, just having them kind of swirling in your head. You're just so much more likely to achieve them and get to that end goal when you have it written out and you have it just in front of you and seeing it every day. And so that just kind of applies to the home search as well, just as a whole, wanting to develop a wants versus needs list and really sticking to that needs list as a whole as well. Um, So moving into the, the second kind of big stress item, and it is really the timeline pressure, feeling pressured into a specific timeline. And we kind of talked about this in an episode a couple of weeks ago about, trying to buy in 30 to 45 days. That in itself is absolutely going to invoke a feeling of stress in you. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're a perfect borrower, with perfect credit, know exactly what you want. It is absolutely going to invoke stress on you. And so I think that this point really just kind of goes back to, the prep work as a whole, making sure that if you know that your lease is coming up in 6 months, at the end of 6 months, at that point, we know we want to buy. It's time to start preparing now. It's not time to start preparing, 3 weeks, 45 days before that lease ends. You're already kind of behind the eight ball in that aspect if you haven't started preparing. And, that timeline can definitely invoke pressure and invoke stress in your life. I've seen it firsthand with clients. Again, I've honestly went through it myself. When we first tried to buy a home, I think a few years ago, maybe 2021 or so, we didn't really get started in time for what the market dictated at that point because of how competitive and how fast you had to move on things. We weren't really prepared for that, and we didn't get started in time, and with kind of how the lease end date lined up with our lives, and that definitely invoked a little bit of stress. We kind of looked at each other like, do we need to settle on something? Do we want to put an offer in on something that we don't really love? Like, ultimately, we didn't make that decision, and I'm glad that we didn't. But that kind of taught us a lesson for the next time when we ultimately did end up buying our home, is we have to start preparing a little bit further ahead of time, especially if your market is dictating that fact as well. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a perfect point there. And I think it goes into, again, some topics that we have covered so far this year, which is, you guys, you got to be prepared if you want to have less stress in this situation. When it comes to buying a home, you've got to put the prep work in. Got to. I cannot say that enough, because ultimately, yeah, we have clients all the time who will come and try to make it a 45-day process, and it is just, we can tell the stress on the other side of the phone when we're having conversations with them, that this is not just, something that is very easy and simple for them. They are going through it, and obviously we're doing the best that we can to help reduce the stress in that situation. However, there are just a lot of factors that go into getting a mortgage, and it is not something that can just be narrowed down to a 30, 45-day process. So do the prep work, get it done early if that's something that you want to do, and I promise you, you will feel a weight. You may not, because we're telling you to take we're telling you to do this ahead of time. So obviously, unless you have that direct, experience like Zach's talking about of trying to rush it, you're not going to know what that stress necessarily feels like until you do that. So obviously, if you prep, you're going to feel less stress, so you won't have something to compare it to. But that's ultimately the whole point, is to avoid that, because I can assure you that it is something that people feel a lot of stress doing. Um,
it's like
Jeff, something
trying
you want to
to,
add?
yeah. It's like, honestly, a good example of on this front is like trying to run a marathon with like no training, like just
Yeah.
like deciding one day, like, yeah, we're going to go run a marathon, 26 miles. Like, I've only ever ran 1 mile at one time, but you know what? I don't need to train. I'm just going to go in and I'm going to go run this marathon. And usually that's probably not going to work out for the best, in that situation. So,
Well, I have my own personal take on that, because I did a ruck race last year after doing one the year prior. And the year prior, I came in very prepped, very prepared. And last year, the training was not there. I did not do what was necessary. And leading up into that, yes, I felt a higher level of stress than I did the year before, because ultimately I had not taken the steps that I needed to. And in that instance, I knew what was waiting for me out there. The first year, obviously, is kind of just, you don't really know. You think you know until you're out there and you do it. And so with knowing, I was like, I I definitely felt a higher level of stress going into it. Like I did not prep for this. I did not prepare in the way that I needed to. So this should be very interesting. And so it's true. I mean, in all areas of life, that is something that, doing the prep work, putting the work in early is always going to save you stress on the back end. It's not going to eliminate it, but it's going to save you part of it. Right. So, and then the last one that we already kind of talked about, but that is the fear of regret, right? And so with a purchase of this size, with a decision of this size, there's always going to be that stress of, am I making the right decision? Is this the right thing for me to do? And what happens if it's not? Am I going to regret this decision later? Um, and that's going to lead you to probably second guessing a lot of the moves that you make. You're going to feel an uneasiness about the decision. And so that's again why I think it's really important to not rush. That's another factor that will go into it is when you do understand, when you have sat down, when you've done the prep work, when you've had those conversations internally or amongst your family. And when I say family, like, I mean, if you're buying with a spouse, if you're, you know what I'm saying? When you've had those conversations about, hey, this is what we want, this is where we're at, and you've actually given it some time and thought and put that into it, it's going to reduce your fear of regret ultimately, right? Because you're going to feel pretty steadfast in that decision that you're making. Whereas if you're just kind of throwing, you know, throwing stuff at the wall, hoping that it'll stick, you're probably going to open up the door for there being a level of regret, and I know, Zach, just kind of like you were talking about 2021, settling for something less than what you wanted. Had you guys have gone through with that decision, there probably would have been a level of regret to that because ultimately you're just kind of throwing some stuff. We just want to buy a house, just throwing some stuff out there, hoping that it'll, stick to the wall and you'll be good to go. And I think ultimately, like you said, we're glad we did not do that. So time and the reflection of that obviously allowed you to have that, that feeling of, okay, yes, we made the right decision by not doing that. So you saved yourself ultimately that regret that potentially could have came from that. So, and again, that's just being honest, just because even if you've done the prep work and you've looked at it and it doesn't make sense right now, that's still okay, right? It doesn't need to be, oh, do the prep work so I can 100% ensure. Maybe you do the prep work and you realize, hey, this is just not the right time for us. This is not the right timing. We need a little bit, maybe give it another year and then we'll revisit it again. And even inside of that decision, you're going to feel a lot less stress than trying to force something that doesn't fit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it applies across all walks of life. Honestly, it really does. So good stuff there for sure.
For sure, man. Well, why don't you take us into, I know we kind of covered it a little bit, inside of each of those stressors, but, what's going to reduce this feeling of being overwhelmed for clients? What is going to kind of take that down a notch for them?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, the biggest one that I touched on already is, just feeling and knowing what is normal, just knowing that having these stressors and, things that happen throughout the process and feeling overwhelmed, it is absolutely normal, especially for first time home buyers. And I think that that's kind of, the first step is kind of acceptance, just making sure that you are aware that you are going to feel like this. And number two, there are ways to combat it. And that is, having clarity on your situation, having that wants versus needs list, and making sure that we are absolutely checking off the needs of the process. Having just clarity on your loan programs and your in the type of home that you're looking for and the market as a whole around you and what that is dictating, and how offers need to be presented to win the house in the market. Just having that clarity is absolutely going to allow you to make better decisions and feel more vindicated in those decisions, and ultimately take those stress levels down, take the overwhelmness down, because when you have that clarity, it just you know that you're making the right decision. You don't feel like you're going to have regret later on if you have that clarity and have just a clear mind. Again, when you have so much information floating up there in the mind, it is so easy to make a wrong decision, or not even just make the wrong decision, but convince yourself in that moment that the wrong decision is the right one. And again, when you have the clarity, when you have the mental fortitude to, take these things and, compartmentalize them and make the decisions from there, it is absolutely going to lead you down a path of success. Whether, ultimately, like you said, you do get the home, or B, you decide that this isn't the right time and, start preparing for the time that is the correct time. Again, you just have to kind of break the process into phases a little bit. And that's, getting started at the pre-approval process. And then when you go out on the home search, and then ultimately when you have an offer accepted, into the contract process as well. Kind of just have to break those into phases and understand, that overwhelmness is absolutely a validated feeling, but there are ways to combat it absolutely as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think ultimately, I want to, I guess leave on this note as we, kind of wrap up on all of that is that, you know, feeling overwhelmed doesn't necessarily mean that you're not ready to buy a home. It just means that you're about to step into something very important in your life. And, all buyers are going to feel overwhelmed on some level. The whole point of this is to, again, like we said, normalize it. It's not to eliminate it. It's not to, see if you can just feel this sense of zen about the whole, transaction, because ultimately that's unrealistic, right? If you've never done something like this in your life, you're not necessarily going to feel, that no matter how hard you try. So again, trying to force something that doesn't fit, you can't take this process and force yourself to feel a way that you just don't feel, right? Because that's just going to lead to more stress. So embracing that feeling of overwhelming, understanding that that is normal, that all buyers go through it, and then obviously taking that feeling and compartmentalizing the important things that you need to check off of your list, whether that's your loan program, whether that's the specific house, making sure that you're getting exactly what you need, again, is not going to eliminate you feeling overwhelmed, but it is a good indicator of, okay, these are the things I need to focus on. This is what I need to take away from this. This is what I need to do in order to make sure that I am making the right decision for me. And so, you don't have to have everything figured out all at once. That's not the goal of this. That's why we talked about, a 90-day plan. And honestly, you could go even further than that. It could be a 180-day plan if you want it to be. It could be a 12-month plan if you want it to be. There is no right or wrong answer to buying a home. But obviously, whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever is important for you, that is the timeline that you need to go off of. So if you need a little bit more time to make your decisions, then take that time. But don't just, yeah, I'm going to make the decision, and then don't put the work in that, 180 days to make sure that you feel good when the day starts. Because oftentimes people be like, yeah, I'm not going to buy a home for 6 months, but then they'll wait for 3 months and not really necessarily do anything. And then they've shrunk that timeline from 180 days back down to 90, right? So you have to take the steps needed in order to gain that clarity, in order to gain that knowledge in that timeline that you're looking for. And I think ultimately this just goes to something that I'm a big believer in, which is one step at a time, one day at a time, whatever sport you play, you know, one snap at a time. It doesn't matter. Don't overcomplicate the situation. You're not trying to cram everything you need to into a week timeline. Just take one step at a time, one day at a time. Check off your list, whatever it is that you need to do that day in order to push yourself forward to the next day, the next day, the next day. And over time, we all know the compound effect, right, of what will happen if you stack these things on top of each other for a long enough period of time. So don't feel like you have to go figure it all out tomorrow. Start with one task that will take you to that next level of clarity, that next level of knowledge that you're looking for on this journey. And by the time you're ready to buy a home, you are going to feel night and day better.
Absolutely. That was a great point there with the compound effect. Honestly, that is, it's truly one of the strongest principles in life, in society as a whole. You don't really realize how much better you will get after, X amount of days, X amount of years. If you get better in that time period, one by one, it's just you can't put a price on that. Ultimately, you will be astounded how much better you are if you get 1% better every single day in whatever you're doing. At the end of the time period, again, it's astounding how well that, compounding works, and finance, and real estate, and personal development, all, any of the above. It really is. It's crazy how much it works.
Could not agree more, man. Could not agree more. So, guys, we just want to leave you with this. Obviously, buying is a big decision. It should feel like a big decision. We're not trying to eliminate that. Again, I just want to drive that home, that this is something that you should take seriously, and it should be a big decision in your life, and you should treat it as such. But understand that inside of that, obviously, there can be ways to pull different levers to create clarity, to create that sense of feeling like you're on the right track, right? And again, we're not trying to eliminate nerves. We're not trying to eliminate being overwhelmed. We're not trying to eliminate stress, because if you do that, you're just going to add more on. I can assure you, anytime I've ever tried to eliminate stress in my life, I've just become more stressed in trying to do that. So I think it just goes back to ultimately stacking those little wins on top of each other, and then just continuing to go from there, to create a sense of clarity over the long term.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely. Great points there. So I think that is all that we have for today's episode.
Yes, sir.
Again, guys, we come out with episodes every single Friday, 12 p.m., trying to help you as the home buyer, and especially first-time home buyers, get started on this journey with education to, again, provide clarity for these situations, to hopefully help you as you get started on your journey. Anything else that you'd like to add, Sam?
Nope. I think you covered it all. Yeah. Appreciate you guys tuning in as always. And if you know anybody who's in the market to buy, and you feel like this content would help benefit them, we would obviously love if you shared the show with them, and passed it along. And obviously that's our goal, is to reach as many home buyers as we can, to hopefully help to give a different perspective on what buying a home is actually like, fill the void of probably the lack of information that most people have when it comes to that. So anything that you guys can do when it comes to sharing and passing that along to friends, family, obviously we always appreciate it, and appreciate you guys tuning in as well.
Absolutely, guys. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you guys in the next episode.
See you guys.